Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2012 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. I'm going to first of all ask everyone present to please turn off mobile phones, Blackberries, tablets and any other electronic devices. Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Yes, thank you. Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business today is to take oral evidence from the David Hume Institute as part of the committee's scrutiny of the draft budget 2013-14. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting, in alphabetical order, Stephen Boyle, RBS Group Economics, welcome. Ian Diamond, Professor Ian Diamond from the University of Aberdeen. John Hughes, Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce. Donald McRae, Lloyd's Banking Group. Colin Mason, Adam Smith Business School. Jeremy Peat, the David Hume Institute, and Ian-Ritchie, Royal Society of Edinburgh. So welcome to you all. As you'll have seen from the Clerk's briefing paper, this session will address three key issues. Firstly, the role of higher education and skills development, which will be led by Professor Diamond. Lessons from successful Scottish companies, which will be led by Professor Mason. And finally, access to finance and stimulating investment, which will be led by Ian-Ritchie. So, first of all, I would like to ask Professor Diamond to kick off. And I intend to allocate around 30 minutes for each topic. So please indicate to me whether you wish to contribute to the discussion, and people will be allowed to contribute based on how I see them. So if I see you, you will be in. And I'd also like to welcome Bruce Crawford to the committee, who has arrived somewhat late for this morning's start of the meeting. Professor Diamond.
Shall I kick off?
Yes,
thank you very much, and just say a few words. Firstly, I don't think I need to remind this committee that Scotland has an extremely high-class higher education sector, and one which is fully committed to providing the skills for the knowledge economy that Scotland will need to be if it is to be as successful in the next few years as we all wish it to be. I should say, firstly, just a couple of points. Firstly, that graduates from Scotland have higher probabilities of going into graduate education than those in England. The starting salary for Scottish university graduates is higher than the average for the UK. In general, I think Scotland's universities are completely committed to providing the education and training that is needed. Now, that's the first point. Second point is that when one thinks about skills at higher education level, those skills do not necessarily mean direct training for a particular employment. Certainly, for example, in medicine, almost all medical students become doctors. That is not the case in many degrees. And what Scotland's universities have done, and my own university as an example, is to work with employers, to work in, for example, in my own university, working with the employers that our graduates go to, together with the CBI, to identify a set of graduate attributes that we would want to see. Those graduate attributes include excellence. You're getting nowhere unless you have intellectual rigour and breadth in your degree. The belief in lifelong learning. The critical thinking that is necessary, together with the ability to work in a team, to identify problems, to be able to communicate properly and to think independently. And the general development of the often young, but sometimes increasingly older young person as a citizen. And these things, we believe, work incredibly well with our employers to develop people with the skills who are needed to take forward the vast cornucopia of Scottish employment. I should say we're also fully committed to working very hard and try to work very hard with industry to provide employment opportunities during internships, during the degree, and that includes working in the third sector. There are third sector internships that we use that I think are incredibly important. And indeed, my own university provides internships within the university. So we think that is incredibly important. We would say very clearly in finality that there is a huge need to increase the number of people from Scotland who are taking postgraduate taught courses, because in many areas of industry that is the, if you like, the entrance level qualification in all kinds of areas, in particularly the life sciences, in energy, finance and business services. They require postgraduate taught skills, and we need to make sure that we have processes and financing which enable the best people to take postgraduate taught courses regardless of their background. I'll stop there if I may, but the bottom line is that Scotland's universities are completely committed and are working with employers to get the kind of skills that are needed for employment.
Ron Mason.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, you talked about kind of general excellence and suggested that having a broad education was a good thing, but we've also heard that there's going to be a shortage of engineers in a few years, and yet I get people with politics degrees kind of crawling out the woodwork asking for jobs. Are we getting the wrong people with the wrong qualifications?
I would say very clearly that we do need to continue to increase the number of engineers that we're training. That's absolutely clear. But I would not say that the number of political science students that we have are not getting jobs. I mean, working as you do as an MSP, it's pretty likely that political science students will want to come and work with you. And we think some of our students have fantastic internships here in the Scottish Parliament. But I don't think the mix is wrong. But if there are particular areas where we believe that the skills shortage is high, and there is a recent PricewaterhouseCoopers report which points to that in the energy sector, then that is the area that we ought to be saying, okay, we need some more graduates in that area. And in the new outcome agreements, which the Scottish which the Scottish Funding Council has indicated, in the one that from my own university, we suggest that next year we would be prepared to take an extra 50 engineering undergraduates to address the point that you make.
Jean Urquhart, to be followed by Ian-Ritchie.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I just wanted to ask, I've come recently from the Education Committee, and I remember a round-table discussion there where I think a few eyebrows shot up when we asked about the Aberdeen universities collectively and the industry, the oil industry, using them in terms of research and so on, to discover that actually, and I can't remember where, but there was a university, I think in South America, that seemed to be top of the list for that sort of work, and that the universities in Aberdeen were slightly kind of bypassed on that. Do you have anything, make a comment about that? I
couldn't speak to that particular point. I would note that just last Friday, the Westminster Prime Minister signed an agreement in Brazil for the University of Aberdeen to work with BG to provide research linked to the Brazilian oil industry. I would also note that with regard to skills, my own university, together with Robert Gordon's University, Aberdeen College and Banff and Buchan College, were mentioned last week in Mr Swinney's budget statement with regard to the Energy Skills Academy that we have, which is providing skills. I might also note that oil and gas research is incredibly important, not only in engineering, where we at the University of Aberdeen are working with Scottish Enterprise on a area of new drilling, a way of drilling which will make it possible to get more oil, I hope, out of the North Sea, but also in geoscience, in law and in business, where there is very strong research, not only in my university, but also in other universities in Scotland, which is linked highly to the oil and gas industry. And indeed, I would say that in economics, the best oil and gas economic researcher in the world sits in my university.
Thank you. Ian-Ritchie would follow by Michael McMahon.
I think, following on John Mason's comments, I think it's very unfair to blame the universities. I'm independent of the university sector, but the universities in Scotland do train more scientists and engineers than in the rest of the UK, and so we do quite well in that, and we could do more. The problem is not at university level, the problem is at school level. Kids who are bright kids are not encouraged to go into science and technology and engineering. They don't see the future. They have no visibility of the careers that they can lead to. These, I mean, very, very exciting. I mean, I'm an engineer, and I've had a very exciting career, and I've made lots of money and all these sort of things. So, you know, there's a real future for kids at school going into these careers, but they don't see those. You know, they see on TV, they see other, you know, occupations, or they see politics as being, you know, whatever. And so they don't really see through. And I think the fault lies with the level of ambition in schools to encourage kids to go into science and engineering. You know, my nephew's daughter was very good at maths and physics, and I tried to encourage her to go on and do that as a career, but she just couldn't visualize herself as a scientist. And she's gone to do English. And, you know, we have very, very bright kids who are not going into engineering and science, and we're just not giving them the message that it's a good thing to do.
See, I've made a visit to 11 of my schools this year, and every one of them I've mentioned the issue of engineering, you know, as being a tremendous career for the future in Scotland, and one that will be there for many decades to come, and is growing actually. And I think the schools are starting to address that issue, certainly in my area. Michael, to be followed by Elaine.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's just to make an observation and see if anyone wants to correct me in terms of my perception. But a lot of the students who go directly into engineering and science don't necessarily go direct from school into university. Some of them come through colleges. They see that as a vocational qualification, which then leads to the further education sector. Is the downturn in the number of college places going to have an impact at any point in the future in relation to that? Because obviously the numbers might be holding up of those going to direct entry from school to university, but if the stream of people coming out of colleges into university having done a vocational qualification at college starts to dry up, that could lead to problems in the longer term.
Could I respond to that particular point?
Yes,
Chair. Do you mind? I think that's a very valid point. I think it is incredibly important that we have strong articulation agreements between college and university to enable people to go into college and then on to university, or to finish at college, if that is what is wanted. That is why we have at the University of Aberdeen very strong articulation agreements with Aberdeen College and with Banff and Buchan College, and just in the last 3 days with regard to the engineering industry, I've talked with Forth Valley College, the New Edinburgh College and Carnegie College about articulation agreements around engineering to make that happen. Clearly, when I've talked to those principals and to the other college principals that I've talked to, there is a huge commitment to providing the skills that are needed in engineering, in oil and gas, whether it's downstream or upstream, or in the renewables. And I just think it needs a proper, mature conversation with the industry employers to make sure that we do train enough people, because clearly it's all in all our interests so to do.
Thank you. My understanding is the number of college places was to remain the same, but we can maybe expand on that as we go forward. Elaine, to be followed by Professor Mason.
Thanks, Convener. A couple of points. Really, one was in terms of what Professor Diamond said about the majority, you're not necessarily going into the subject that you train for at university, that it opens a door, but it's not necessarily you're going to be doing the subject you trained at university. And if that is the case, to a certain extent, what is the point in people doing academic training in certain subjects if they're never actually going to use that again? And should the courses maybe not be more applied and reflect the needs of industry or the needs of the outside world, rather than giving people an academic background which they're not actually going to ever exercise again? And the other one was about the postgraduate qualifications being an entry-level requirement in many jobs. There's a major issue about how that's funded. A postgraduate taught education can cost £5,000 in fees, plus the living expenses of being there. That, if you've got a youngster from a not particularly well-off background who already has debt associated not with tuition fees, of course, in Scotland, but actually with the living expenses of being at university, taking on that another burden of debt, several thousands of pounds, can be very off-putting if you're not sure that's another job at the end of that. And is there perhaps a role for engaging employers and helping to sponsor people to do that type of training, if that is a requirement to get in.
Could I just respond very quickly to both those points, or perhaps pick it up later?
Because Ian, because I've got 4 other people wanting to speak, and then I'll bring you in after them, because some haven't been had a chance to speak yet. Professor Mason to be followed by Jeremy Peat. Sorry. It's okay, it'll come on.
Oh, okay. Let me start with a conversation I had with somebody from the IT industry a couple of years ago. I asked him who he worked for, and he looked at me like an idiot and said, nobody works for anybody in IT. I think we have to recognise the labour market is changing. The job, in the sense of being employed by an organisation, is disappearing. Many sectors of the economy, particularly the creative industry, is organised around projects. Like a movie. People come together with different skills for a limited duration, undertake the project, and then dissipate and find other projects to do. I did some work with music students, students who are professional musicians. None of them have jobs. They're all freelance, self-employed, have portfolio careers. This is the way in which more and more graduates are going to be earning a living. And I don't think, to be fair, universities are actually equipping students to operate in this kind of labour market. I think we really should push the entrepreneurship agenda much more strongly in our universities and indeed our colleges. This should be recognised as a necessary life skill for our graduates. And bear in mind the MIT example of a dynamic technology cluster. Most of the businesses started around MIT were not by the academics, but by the alumni. So I would plead for a recognition of the nature of how graduates in the future are going to be earning their living, and suggest that we need to equip them more effectively for an entrepreneurial, a freelance, a consultancy career.
Jeremy, to be followed by Professor McCrae.
Thank you, Convener. 2 points, if I may. First of all, the reference to further education I find interesting. I think that this articulation and the role of developing people to go on for science and education is very important. And I would note that it's going to be difficult for some FE colleges, which are going through a process of regionalisation and change, and at the same time under a lot of pressure to help meet the targets so far as young people are concerned and giving an opportunity for all. It's going to be quite difficult for them at a time of constrained budgets to also put the funding into the skills development that I think is very important and where they have a particular role to play. So I think this committee may wish to just consider whether there are issues about prioritisation of funding for FE that it will enable it to play its right and proper role, particularly in science, engineering and related activities. That's the first point. The second point is that Ian Darman mentioned very briefly the outcome agreements that each HE institution and each FE institution is agreeing at the moment with the Scottish Funding Council, which I believe will be published sometime within the next month or so. And I think these are a tremendous development. Many years ago, both Ian and I were on the Scottish Higher Education Funding Council, and the idea of having actual outcome agreements which talk about what the institutions were going to achieve and how that related to the economy, that was a little bit of a dream rather than a reality. It's now becoming a reality. And I think it's a great development and which will enable the universities to think through what they're trying to achieve in the context of the economic strategy for Scotland, in the context of priorities. Now, this is the first time round. This is, to some extent, a pilot of how it's going. But I think, again, it's going to be very important to have guidance as to what the strategy is and the level down from the strategy, which identify for the growth agenda in particular, what HE and FE institutions can best provide, individual institutions one by one. And I think this is a major development which can really work to enhance the cost effectiveness of these institutions in the context of the Scottish economy at this very difficult time. So I would place a lot of importance on this development, and I think it's be well worth, again, this committee having a look at that and thinking how it relates to your views on priorities for the economy.
Thank you. Professor McCrae, followed by Stephen Boyle.
Yeah, good morning. I make these comments with noting my interest as a member of the Skills Committee, independent member of the Skills Committee between Scottish Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council, and also a board member of Interface, which is designed to promote business and university interaction. I start from the position that Scotland's economic performance has been quite moderate over the past few decades. You then look at, well, what are the level of skills, the level of human capital, and actually, when you look at the, for example, PISA scores, the percent of graduates and so on, we come out quite well. So I don't believe that explanation for our low level of economic performance is a low level of human skills or human capital. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't constantly strive to improve the levels of these skills. What I think we do have a problem is the utilisation of these skills. And I think that's very clear. And that is related to the ability of businesses to use the skills that are being generated by the educational systems, schools, colleges and the universities. That also feeds into the problem of the low level of business startups and the low level of business stock, the number of businesses per head of population in Scotland. All these are linked. So I would suggest that we don't have a problem with the level of skills, but we do have an issue with the utilisation of these skills in our businesses.
Thank you. Stephen Boyle to be followed by Professor Diamond.
Thank you. There's been absolutely no consultation between Donald McRae and myself, but let me extend the point that Donald has just made. Not only is the quality of Scotland's human capital strong and one of our genuine sources of economic potential, we are particularly strong at higher education level. If the committee wants to worry about things in terms of the quality of human capital, without being complacent about it, don't worry about the quality of the outputs of our higher education system. We can see that in the evidence of the wage premium that people earn. We can see it in the evidence of surveys. We are good at this. The challenge, I think, in terms of human capital doesn't lie with the more highly skilled. It lies with people who are doing jobs that require lower levels of skills and qualifications. And if I wanted to worry about something in the human capital sphere in Scotland, it would be that. Final point on education, and I'll be mildly heretical here. I think I'm now old enough to be able to say there have never been enough engineers in Scotland, at least since Victorian times. We've been worrying about this for years. I think the truth of the matter is that we do not value engineering sufficiently to attract people to do it. And by that I mean what engineers produce doesn't allow businesses to pay them high enough wages to make engineering sufficiently attractive against other things. And you can't wish that away.
That's a very salient point, actually. I think it's also the old issue about people getting their hands dirty as opposed to going into professions. I think a lot of people try and encourage their children into the professions, and that has been the case and is likely to remain the case, to be fair. Even though we will do our best to try and get people into engineering, the salaries for top engineers are actually increasing substantially, which is something to be welcomed. Professor Diamond to follow by Gavin.
Just very quickly, salaries in the oil and gas industry for engineers because of supply and demand are very good, and there are opportunities for people to move to the northeast. But the two questions very quickly, if I may, to respond to, and firstly, should people only do vocational degrees? I'd have to say with respect that I'd argue that... Okay, I mean, I think that we really do need to understand that not every person doing a history degree is going to become a historian, nor perhaps would we want that many historians. But the critical thinking, the analytical thinking, the ability to problem solve, the ability to be able to address things, say, that would not normally maybe coming a little out of left field, are the sorts of skills that are needed in many, many occupations, be it management, be it the civil service, be it the third sector, whatever. And I think we do need to continue to worry about the kind of skills that people get, but through an education rather than simply through applied degrees. I couldn't agree more with your point about postgraduate taught funding. That's why we at the University of Aberdeen, along with all other universities, work incredibly hard with employers, often for us with the oil and gas industry, to provide scholarships. We also work very hard with our donors, our alumni often, to provide scholarships for people with disadvantaged backgrounds to enable them to attend a postgraduate taught course. It is something that I believe the government needs to think more about in order to think about how we do enable people to take postgraduate taught skills, because notwithstanding my complete agreement with Stephen Boyle on lower level skills, I do think at the absolute highest level we need those skills as well. And with regard to Colin Mason's point, I completely agree we need to build entrepreneurship. That's why I said in my initial remarks an understanding of enterprise and indeed entrepreneurship is, I think, an essential part of an undergraduate degree.
Thank Followed by Bruce.
Restricting their remarks to higher education and skills development, I just wonder if any of our witnesses have any comments or observations they want to make specifically on the 2013-14 draft budget.
I'll leave that hanging. Bruce?
Well, I was coming back to something similar at the end of my, just a quick comment first of all. I'm intrigued by some of the discussion that's going on between the links between further on higher education and how important that is obviously to the growing of the Scottish economy. But I think it's more about how we use the places in higher education in particular, because if my understanding right from the budget's right, it's the Cabinet Secretary's committed to 116,000 places last year, the same this in the budget going forward. So I've got two questions, the second one linked to where Gavin was coming from. First of all, how do, if that's the case, if the numbers are staying at the same, can we best use these number of places to create the right type of person who can then go on to university? How can we better do that? And secondly, given that we are in the budget process, what changes can we make through the budget process that can help that flow from further to higher education? I think that would be helpful for us, given that's one of the central things that's been said.
Now, no one has actually asked to speak at this point, so I'm going to move on to the second part of our discussion. But we can go back to any of the points that have obviously been raised that people have been thinking about. But I want to ask Professor Mason to perhaps lead us off in talking about lessons from successful Scottish companies. I noticed that in our briefing, in the on the aspect of the issue of high growth firms, they're defined as enterprise with average annualised growth and employs a turnover greater than 20% per annum over a 3-year period. Actually, some 4% of Scottish companies are in that category, which shows the kind of that there are, even in recession, some really dynamic sectors of our economy. And clearly, in terms of the draft budget and the ambition of the Scottish Government, and indeed all parties within the Parliament, sustainable economic growth is a fundamental issue which we want to take forward. So, Professor Mason. And again, people, let me know if you wish to.
The Danish physicist Niels Bohr is quoted as follows: prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. But I think we can be reasonably confident in predicting that Scotland's future jobs will be created by entrepreneurs who start and grow companies. The question is, what kind of entrepreneurs should government be supporting? Should be supporting ants, mice, gazelles, or gorillas? An increasing number of small businesses, as I said in my earlier remarks, are actually sole proprietors, freelancers, and independent consultants. And this group are increasing because of changes in the labour market, which is increasingly organised around limited duration projects. They're, if you like, the ants. The vast majority of small businesses, which you might term the mice, are micro businesses employing a handful of people at most. These are lifestyle businesses with limited ambition and probably limited potential to grow. But they're the bedrock of the economy and the bedrock of communities. But there is considerable debate whether it's good public policy to actively encourage people to set up micro businesses on the grounds that they have limited growth potential, high failure rates, and very often simply displace one another. Instead, it's been argued the focus should be on creating more high-growth firms, the so-called gazelles, which research tells us create the majority of new jobs in the economy. So that 4%, in another study it was 6%, were responsible for over 50% of the jobs created by that cohort. Research also tells us that although Scotland's proportion of high-growth firms is slightly above the UK average, Scottish high-growth firms are not as prolific job creators as their counterparts in the rest of the UK. Moreover, there's a lot of myths about high-growth firms. They are not disproportionately in high-tech sectors. They are not disproportionately university spin-offs. In fact, hardly any of them are university spin-offs. They're not actually particularly R&D or science-oriented or deeply engaged with the university research base. They are, however, knowledge-based and innovative in their own sectors, often with innovative business models rather than innovative technology. And they're not necessarily particularly young. Most of the high-growth companies in our study for Scottish Enterprise were actually over 10 years old. The reality is that high-growth firms are found in all sectors, they're of all ages, all sizes, and all locations. You simply can't predict where they will emerge. Moreover, a significant minority of high-growth firms are actually either management buyouts, management buy-ins, or employee buyouts. having been incubated in other organisations, and then their management team has raised the finance to buy them out to run as independent businesses. And it does raise the question, how many other potential high-growth companies are, if you like, imprisoned in our large companies, and perhaps starved of the investment to grow if they were independent companies? Moreover, many of these high-growth companies defy any kind of simplistic manufacturing services distinction. And actually, the business model is to offer a range of services built around a product. So again, simplistic manufacturing services distinctions just don't actually operate in the real world. Policymakers appear to have a fixation on technology sectors as a source of high-growth companies. But I think Scotland has got the wrong kind of technology base to be a source of significant numbers of high-growth firms. Scotland is overweight. Scotland's research is based predominantly public sector, university, rather than private sector research. A final point is that high-growth companies have got a high probability of being taken over by foreign or non-local companies. Of the 20 or so companies we looked at in depth 2 or 3 years ago, about 3 or 4 of them are no longer independently owned companies anymore. Why? Well, if they've raised venture capital, then part of the venture capital investment model is they need an exit. And sadly, venture capitalists prefer to do a trade sale to get their money back rather than an initial public offering on the stock market. It may simply be exhaustion by the entrepreneurs and investors. One company I interviewed had 13 rounds of finance. And you can understand investors being somewhat impatient to get the money out of the business. Or it may, in some cases, be limited ambition. But this acquisition of a high-growth companies, I think, has got negative consequences over the longer term. Initially, there may well be a big boost to the companies who are taken over, but in the longer term, we see a loss of head offices in Scotland. We see a loss of senior management jobs. I interviewed one company and said, well, what's the future? Are you likely to be taken over? The managing director said, if we were taken over, the first thing that would happen would be they would close this place down, pointing to his head office. It's damaging to the supply chain, potential transfer of intellectual property out of Scotland, and very often, ultimately, closure results. The effect of the takeover and acquisition of these gazelles is we have relatively few gorillas. These are companies, the kind of anchor companies in the economy, 100 million turnover and above. They're a head office in Scotland, managed and owned in Scotland, and which anchor the economy and generate all sorts of positive externalities. So the challenge is not just creating more high-growth firms, but it's also keeping them owned and managed in Scotland. How could we do this? Well, we simply can't pick winners. We can't predict where high-growth firms are coming from in advance, either on a firm level or a sector level. Early-stage support is critical. A lot of the companies we interviewed, it was the support they got in the early stages that was actually critical. So we need a package of early support that is relevant to potential high-growth firms. So that means things like equity finance, export assistance, management training. Secondly, we need to build on Scottish Enterprise's account management system of relationship support, which enables support to be delivered both timely to companies that are growing and also customised to their needs. And we shouldn't discriminate against our entrepreneurs in favour of foreign companies. 2 of the entrepreneurs I interviewed, believe it or not, said we were turned down for support because we were deemed to be too successful. I mean, beggars belief. But when we have regional selective assistance, it's much harder for an indigenous company to demonstrate additionality. A foreign company can say, well, if the Scottish Government doesn't give us support, we'll go to Ireland. Much harder for a locally based company to kind of make that claim. So we have to be more sympathetic to supporting our local entrepreneurs. With the reality, there's certainly a perception amongst many of our local entrepreneurs that the knee-jerk reaction of government is to see foreign firms more favourably than our own independent champions. And finally, we should use local procurement more effectively. Much better than a grant, much better than a loan is actually revenue. And many of the companies I talked to really bemoaned the fact that they had to go overseas for the sales, which of course is good for the economy. But it's much harder to get sales overseas if your own government is not initially backed you. Thank you.
Thank you. Plenty of food for thought. And Professor McRae will be the first to comment, followed by Ian-Ritchie.
I think this is one of the most important pieces of work in the sort of history of economic development in Scotland that I've seen over the past few decades. We need to know where growth comes from. We now know that they come from let's be frank, a small number of high-growth firms. We also know that Scotland has quite a reasonable percentage of these high-growth firms, but it's a percentage of a low business base. So the actual number of high-growth firms is still relatively small. I think a very important conclusion out of this research is that policy needs to be, or take account of the fact that high-growth firms occur in all sectors. And that needs to be taken account of by the Scottish Government and by Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise, in that high-growth firms occur across all sectors and not just in the so-called key sectors. That's a very crucial point. The last point is, while I entirely support the conclusions that Colin Mason had on the provision of early support and so on, I would particularly want to see some action on the improvement or the increase of the supply of risk capital in total. The figures I have that for Scotland for the latest available year, 2011, total amount of risk capital from what I have to say is a thriving business angel community matched with government funds is a total of 60 million. Well, that is good, but it doesn't bear comparison to the existing level of debt, which is measured in the tens of billions as opposed to millions. So I would argue for a significant improvement in the supply of risk capital to encourage the conditions where high-growth firms flourish and occur in all sectors.
Thank you. Ian-Ritchie, followed by John Hughes.
I thought Colin Mason's remarks were very, very sound. The one area, I guess, I might take him up on, I mean, I live in the world that Colin examines. I've done over 30 startup companies in the last 25 years. Most of them have been trade sales exits because that's where the world lives, I'm afraid. And it's actually a wee bit of... it's caused, to some extent, by the workings of the British economy. The London Stock Exchange is not a risk market. You can't take a risk company to the London Stock Exchange and expect to prosper there. NASDAQ in New York is the risk market of choice, and that's where you would take an IPO. But obviously, taking a Scottish company to NASDAQ is by no means an easy task. I mean, I know people have done it, but it's a challenge because you're obviously servicing a different sort of financial market. The London Stock Exchange has settled down into being a global market, basically for international mining companies and so forth. You know, so you're not talking about them really being an effective exit for technology. The food chain, the food chain of this sort of thing is you have an innovative company, you build it to a certain level of scale, you prove there's a market there, and then you merge with a company who can take you to that market, and that's just the way the world works. But that doesn't mean to say we can have to give up on this. We can actually still exploit this situation. It's noticeable, for example, that Inverness Medical was sold to Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson has relocated their global diabetics research area now to Inverness, and Inverness is now the world capital of their diabetics research. One of the companies I've co-founded, Voxar, was sold and is now part of Toshiba. And Toshiba Medical, it's now got a business 3 times the size we ever had, based here in Edinburgh. So it's quite possible for these innovative businesses to become a major, perhaps not a headquarters, but a global centre of excellence. And I do think it's something that Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise should perhaps take a wee bit more note of and encourage these sort of businesses, once they've been taken over, to prosper and become the kind of centre of excellence for the world for that particular corporation.
Thank you. John Hughes, to be followed by John Mason.
I work for the Business Gateway contract and work with high-growth companies here in the city. I've done that for about 8 years, so I've got a wealth of anecdotal advice on my work with companies. Myself and other colleagues start about 100 companies a year on Scottish Enterprises growth pipelines, so they satisfy the criteria for that in terms of displacement and achieving the forecast turnover levels. They credibly predict between 200 and 250 million in their 3rd years of trading in combination, and we follow them through. My experience is that, and picking up on Professor Colin Mason's comments, I think everybody should get a chance. I think there's 2 views, that you go for the top ones and you focus on smaller numbers of companies. I don't go with that. I think everybody should get a chance, because otherwise I think you can't pick the winners. And I think it's everybody's right to have a go. I think in Scotland, it's quite frustrating in that there are so many wonderful access to support in terms of academic output. The Scottish Enterprise products are excellent. The Gateway Advisory Service is very, very good when it's well applied. There's good legal and accounting support, access to good IP advice, the university voucher schemes and so on, interface, export advice. Where I find frustration is access to early stage capital. We can get the SMART grants and the R&D grants, but that needs match funding. But when you're moving through to commercialization, you know, we work very closely with the angel community. I've heard Ian-Ritchie speak on this subject before. But access to the Scottish Enterprise Seed Fund is a particular bone of contention with me. I'm a big fan of the co-investment fund. Nelson Gray spoke very well about that with all the stats about 2 weeks ago at the conference Ian chaired. So you've got the holy trinity of those funds, the seed fund, the co-investment fund itself, and the venture fund. The co-investment funds work excellently with high deal turnovers and high sums. The seed fund languishes, and I think it's a criminal that when there's a necessity for access to early stage funding, that one doesn't work. It's not getting the deals, and it's potentially going to lose European funding if it doesn't be active. It's a crucial stage of 20K to 250K. The perception and the reality amongst the angel community and the investees is that it's hard to access. The due diligence isn't proportionate at the lower level and the extreme level. And in actual fact, worst of all, it competes with the co-investment fund where it overlaps it at the 100 to 250K range. The angels, if they're co-investment fund partners, will always go for that because it's a straightforward process to draw that down. And also, more recently, I've got very heavily involved with the SEIS scheme, this excellent tax relief scheme, which again is sort of frustrating in that is bringing other investors, high net worth people into the investment community. But again, there is this issue where SEIS can't issue preference shares, and that gives the risk of annihilation by VCs that's already been alluded to at a later stage of exit. So on the one hand, SEIS is fantastic, terrific tax reliefs, but on the other hand, the threat of VC dilution at a later stage is a major flaw in that process.
Thank you. John Mason to be followed by Professor Peat.
Thanks so much. Well, I was interested in Professor Mason's comments, just the whole area of acquisitions, because that's one that does bother me slightly, both larger and smaller Scottish companies that just get taken over. And, I mean, I'm wondering if it does compare, I mean, Ian-Ritchie made the point about this is where the world lives, but are we different here from other countries? Because my impression is France and Germany, it is not quite the same that companies, either large or small, get taken over quite as readily as ours do. And then I wonder if is it a question of legislation, that the UK legislation is too pro-acquisition instead of being more sceptical, although some of it I know is at a European level, or is it just a question of attitude, that either the business people or government people need to have an attitude of going on more ourselves, encouraging local businesses, as I think you suggested?
Okay, Professor Peat, followed by Professor Diamond.
Thank you, Convener. I do share Donald McRae's views that this is an extremely important piece of research, and as a board member of Scottish Enterprise, I'm delighted to hear the work that's going on high growth firms, and do agree that the work of their account managers is extremely important. And I do believe that we have to focus on success and potential success so far as companies are concerned, and be prepared at this difficult time in the economic cycle to actually be more interventionist from the public sector so far as their development is concerned than I ever thought I would recommend that we should be. I think that it would be a tragedy if any of the high-growth firms were not able to acquire the funds they merited for expansion or innovation or change. And I have encouraged development of relationships between the account managers at SE and the relationship managers at banks. And I think that relationship is now very strong. And I think that can work very well to the benefit of all parties. The relationship managers can gain a better understanding and confidence in companies from knowing that there are account managers working with these companies. And the account managers can also explain to companies what is needed in order for banks to consider finance and to develop that relationship. So I think it's a very beneficial relationship. I was surprised when speaking to the Scottish Funding Council the other day to know that they actually did not have a list of the high growth firms, because I would have thought there would be naturally a relationship between the universities in particular and also the FE institutions and some of the high growth firms to see where they could provide interns to mutual benefit, where they could think about benefits of research, where they could think about placement of students and even sponsorship of students. And I would commend that each institution, Ian may already do this, should have a list of high growth firms in their area and should develop relationships with them, again to mutual benefit. I note the point that John Hughes has made about seed funding, and I may discuss that further in Scottish Enterprise to see how their response is. But I do again note that at this stage where investment has to pick up in the Scottish economy, where we traditionally have had a lower stock of high growth firms than other parts of the UK, we have to focus more and more on maintaining what we have, increasing the number of high growth firms, but also increasing the growth rate and scale of the high growth firms we have. And that may mean not picking winners in terms of some plucking out of the air sectors that may be successful, but picking winners in terms of investing in success and helping to maintain and enhance success. That will be being selective, and I think at this juncture it is the right road to take. Thank you.
It's a diamond to be followed by Stephen Boyle.
Thank you very much. And firstly, just to echo my belief that the work of Colin Mason over many years has been outstanding in this area. I just wanted to make 3 points very quickly. Firstly, Colin mentioned that not all high growth companies, in fact a minority of them, are university spin-outs. That's true, but we do have a very good record in Scotland of university spin-outs, and the figures for 4 or 5 universities in Scotland are incredibly impressive. But it is not only that. The fact that the universities exist means that there are companies growing around them because of the skill base that exists. And one can look to Dundee in bioscience or Dundee indeed in computer games for examples of companies which and clusters of companies which grow up around the fact that there is a research and education base in that area. The other area I'd point out is that many companies or quite a good number of companies in recent years have invested in Scotland because of the quality and the strength of higher education. I might mention Outplay Entertainment or FMC Technologies or Sky, who have all come saying it is the quality of the graduates, it's the quality of the research, which are the reasons for investing. I think we need to keep saying that. And the third point I'd just make is to echo the point that Colin made in passing about procurement. I do think that public sector procurement has a potentially incredibly important role to play in driving innovation. And it's one of those areas, I've said this for many years, other people have said it for many years. It's not impossible to take forward. It will involve some risk, but at the same time, it can have an enormous impact on driving innovation.
Stephen Boyle.
Thank you, Convener. I'll try and briefly make 4 points, and again apologise if it sounds like Donald and I were comparing our homework behind the bike sheds. First of all, we need more businesses in Scotland. That would be a desirable outcome. We have been trying to increase Scotland's business start-up rate, to my knowledge, for more than 35 years. So we've been doing it for decades. The result is, to all intents and purposes, no improvement whatsoever in Scotland's relative business start-up performance. So we have to conclude either that we've been doing the wrong things, or that we've been doing the wrong things badly, or that there's something innate that keeps our business stock relatively low, or that we should be doing something entirely different. Continuing to do what we have done will get us what we have got, in my view. Second, and related to that, Colin Mason made the point about there may be high growth firms trapped away somewhere or other. That may be correct. I reflect on the 1980s and 90s, look at some of the public policy changes that took place then, as a consequence of which, a partial consequence of which, some of Scotland's biggest and most successful companies now exist. I'm thinking of Wiseman's Dairies, Scottish and Southern Energy, First Group, Stagecoach. So A question I think worth considering is whether there are potentially very successful businesses lying in parts of the public sector at the moment. Third point about overseas acquisition. Again, I'm beginning to feel a bit like the old man in the hills here. We've been worrying about this all of my adult life. I agree with Ian-Ritchie. I don't think we should lean against that. Scottish companies are at liberty to acquire companies elsewhere, and I think that's right. And this relates to my final point, which is, again, a point that Colin Mason touched upon in passing. I think an absolutely essential requirement, and the evidence is very, very strong in this for economic growth, is that we allow businesses to fail. If businesses don't fail and exit, if somehow we try to keep businesses alive, then you don't get the competitive urge let loose and you don't drive productivity improvement.
Thank you. Gavin, to be followed by Professor Mason.
I just had I wondered if I could pick on something John Hughes said. He talked about funding and was, I think, very positive about the co-investment fund, less so about the seed fund. I just wondered if he had any experience or direct observations on the other two funds, the Venture Fund or the Scottish Loan Fund.
Mainly involved with the co-investment fund and with the seed fund with more difficulty. The venture fund, it's at a level where I don't get involved with. I think it's 500k up to 2 million, and it works away itself. The Scottish Loan Fund, again, the criteria for that are pretty strict in terms of the turnover level that you need. I think it's somewhere around $1 million turnover.
But then you also want your arms and your legs.
Yeah, there's a lot of fees, and to be honest, you look at this when it first comes out, and then you think, no, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and it doesn't really fit with the early stage companies that I work with, which are some are pre-revenue and some are revenue generating, and the sectors I work with are the whole range. Just picking up on some other points there that Colin Mason made, life sciences, medical devices. I make the distinction between drug discovery and medical devices. In the life science sector, informatics, internet, low tech, the Safe Tray lady that's been profiled by Gateway, but we don't get involved with the Scottish Loan Fund, not at all.
Professor Mason?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank you for the very kind comments that various people have made. I mean, as an academic, it's very satisfying to feel that my research has penetrated beyond academia and has got some kind of value. So it's very satisfying. Anyway, let me just react to some of the really very interesting comments that have been made. The point about the low business base. This is a valid point. If there's some suggestion that this kind of 4% figure of high growth firms is pretty constant over time. So for sure, if we raise the business birth rate and that 4% is pretty constant, then sure we'll get some more high growth firms. So that's certainly a valid point. 35 years of supporting startups without much success. I recall the evaluation of the business birth rate, which started in 1991. The evaluation was done in 2000, suggesting all that had happened was that Scotland had maintained its position. But defenders of the Scottish business birth rate said actually, in relative terms, not an awful lot of money had actually been put in to supporting the business birth rate. So perhaps the problem was we didn't put in enough money really to support business birth rate. Secondly, risk capital. I think if it takes 20 to 30 million pounds probably to grow a global company. We've certainly got a very active business angel base that can put in up to 1 to 2 million. Where we're really lacking, I think, is the 5 to 10 million venture capital money that can really, the development capital money that can grow a business to global scale. Maybe we have to think about can we import venture capital from that kind of venture capital from elsewhere, perhaps. The IPO situation, I mean, Ian is quite right, but there was some research from the Kaufman Foundation earlier this year that looked at the pre-growth and post-growth of IPOs in America. Companies were growing at about 50% in terms of employment and turnover before their IPO, and by about 150% after the IPO. So the fact that for whatever reason we don't have so many IPOs is actually losing us significant potential growth. Trade sales, yes, perhaps it's inevitable. We can certainly quote lots. We can trade off good examples and bad examples of trade sales. If it's inevitable, I think the problem is we're selling our companies too early. The later we can sell them, the more embedded they are, the less likely an acquirer is going to uproot them and take them elsewhere. The more value is created. So when you have the entrepreneurs starting again, the investors starting again, they have more wealth to reinvest. My concern is the norm in the sense that you grow a company to 20 million and you sell it. And entrepreneurs don't really have that ambition to really grow a global company. One of the companies I interviewed, I won't mention the name, but they had a real battle with their VC who wanted to exit the company and sell it out. And this entrepreneur felt there was a lot of growth, and he stuck by his guns. And this is now a global company and a great success story. Ian's point about university spin-offs, the evidence doesn't really support. We've got numerically a lot of university spin-offs, but mostly they're pretty small. Some of the university clusters, like games, and I've done research on the games cluster, it's overhyped. The data just doesn't support the success perhaps it should have been. The point about regulation, deregulation, spot on. A lot of the high-growth companies have been able to grow either because of regulation, recycling, for example, or because of deregulation, buses and so on. So actually, government's most important impact, arguably, is not in the direct support, but it's in how they regulate and deregulate the economy. And the final point on failure, I've got a PhD student who's looking at entrepreneurs who have failed. And it's a traumatic experience if you failed your company, if your company has failed. It's knock-on effects on your social life. I just wonder, as a society, if we're encouraging people to start businesses, we don't have some responsibility to set up some kind of aftercare service for those entrepreneurs who have actually failed. My students' research shows that they're left to their own devices, they don't know where to turn to, and there'll be some kind of, so even some kind of support group of kind of failed entrepreneurs would really be valuable. I think society, as a society, we should actually have a responsibility. If we're wanting people to start businesses, we also have to pick up those who, for whatever reason, are unsuccessful.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to a third section, which we've touched on quite extensively already, which is access to finance and stimulate investment, which should be led by Ian-Ritchie. But after this, I'm going to ask each of our guests around the table, so I'm giving you a wee bit of time to think about it, to ask basically what the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary can do specifically, or is doing, should do, in terms of the draft budget to make things better in terms of small business start-ups and sustainable economic growth in the view of yourself and the organisations that you represent. So some specifics, if possible, on how we can move forward. But first of all, Ian-Ritchie.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. I'm drawing on two reports that I've been responsible for recently. One was the Scottish Science Advisory Council, which Professor Diamond is a member, and the second one is the Royal Society of Edinburgh Business Innovation Forum. The first one, the Scottish Science Advisory Council, a couple of years ago, we had a grouping in the Scottish Science Advisory Council that was an interesting mix. We had several people who had been involved in technology businesses. And spinning out businesses or growing businesses or whatever. And we thought we had the experience really to have a look at this area, because the fact is that Scotland is very preeminent in scientific research. We're way up at the, we're the Andy Murray of scientific research. We're somewhere in the top four, Israel, Switzerland and so forth. We're way ahead of England, way ahead of California on any measure of published scientific papers and citations and so forth. So we're up there at the top, and yet we're not getting the economic benefit. And this is a quandary, that is a dilemma that was Scotland has faced for 30 years. And we thought we'd have a look at this. And actually, when we looked at it, we actually pulled together 4 groups of individuals, of about 20 people per meeting. And these are all people involved in the sort of technology businesses and in growth businesses and so forth. The kind of people who should have had a good relationship with our university sector. And we discovered they didn't have any relationship with the university sector at all, or almost no meaningful relationship. In fact, this is echoed in Colin's report, which I note said that his high-growth firms had almost no connection with the university sector. And our conclusion was that the university sector was living in its own planet. And of course, that's not to be, that's not surprising. I mean, they are excellent at research, and they work with the best researchers in the world. We've got 3 of the world's top 100 universities, 6 of the world's top 200 universities. And these live in their own planet of research excellence. But that's not necessarily economic benefit and so forth. The thing that we feel is we shouldn't be trying to persuade these universities to do more spin-outs, because, as Colin's pointed out, spin-outs don't necessarily really turn into growth companies. The fact of the matter is a good research programme is probably 20, 25 years ahead of market. So if you try and create a company out of that, you're going to have a company that's going to be way, way, way ahead of market, and it's not going to find a ready market and so forth. So spin-outs are not really the answer. The answer is skills, and the answer is skills transfer. The vast majority of students who study and postgraduate study in our Scottish universities are not going to stay in academia. and yet the education they receive is largely geared towards an academic career. So the subjects are taught very much as theoretical subjects and so forth, and they're not really taught as practical subjects, and there's not too much connection between one example, my son went to St Andrews and did maths and physics, and he came out and he didn't know how to negotiate or how to plan a project or how to run a budget, or he didn't know all the sort of basic things you need to know to work in business. And so he went to CELEX and they put him a graduate training program. And the graduate training programs are geared to turn bright kids into workers, and somehow or other we need to face this fact, and we should be building at least some of the business management, project management, scientific management skills into the courses. So that was the major recommendation of our report, that we should be trying to make sure that the universities are more economically connected. I'd actually advise some of the MSPs in the room to have a chat sometime with Joan McAlpine, MSP. Her daughter did engineering at MIT. Now, MIT is actually #1 in the world top 100 universities in the recent thing. But her experience as a student at MIT was dramatically different from the experience of most Scottish students doing engineering. She spent most of the time working with various industrially connected companies and projects and so forth, to almost to the extent that, maybe it's a wee bit too far the other way, but certainly it's a very excellent performance that they create. So that was the one area that we decided that was important, that the Scottish universities should try very hard to connect more economically with the wider economy and have these sort of skills embedded in their courses. We also feel it's important that academics in Scottish universities should be able to work with industry and work with economic activities and get rewards for those. There is the research assessment exercise has included impact in their thing so far, but it's very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to see it happen in practice. I mean, I was on the last 2 research assessment committees, and I was the one non-academic there, and I felt quite lonely. And arguing for this piece of economic work, that this piece of business-related work that an academic doing was every bit as good as a scientific paper was a difficult one to argue, because the scientists couldn't really measure that in the same sort of way. So we do think it's important that universities should be able to reward academics for doing work that's not necessarily research work, that's more economically attached. And we also would like to have a situation where universities can bring people back in from industry into academia. And by and large, that's not really, it's very, very, very difficult to get somebody back in from who goes out into industry back into academia, because they don't have the research record and so forth, and that doesn't really work very well for the universities. So that was the main conclusion of the Scottish Science Advisory Council about basically connecting universities more with the wider economy. Actually, I'd pull on the GEM report. I don't know how many of you know about GEM. GEM is the Global Entrepreneurship Measurement, Monitor, that's right. And it studies 89 countries around the world. And actually, Scotland is an independent measure on the GEM. The Hunter Centre at Glasgow does this as an independent measure for Scotland. So we have measures for Scotland as well as for the UK. And we've got measures for all the other countries in the world, basically, that are in this game. And we actually don't do too badly. We're quite good at early stage financing and all these sort of things. Where we are poor is attitudes to entrepreneurship, attitudes to risk, knowing somebody who started a company. These are all things we're poor at. The old joke about why do the Indians don't have a good football team, and it's because when they're awarded a corner, they open a shop in it, And that implies that the Indians are actually naturally entrepreneurial. They open shops, And the Chinese are naturally, we all know the Jewish people are naturally entrepreneurial. Scots are not naturally entrepreneurial. And we need to do something about the attitude of the Scots towards starting businesses. And our soap operas on TV or radio or whatever, it's always the little businessman that's the crook, And, we have these sort of attitude issues that we need to try and tackle. Anyway, so that's the sort of skilled area. The second one I wanted to pull on was the Scottish, the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Business Innovation Forum. I took over this spring and we decided to tackle the area of financing innovation. Financing is a big issue, and it's a big problem. You've got to find risk. If you've got a company that needs some development, you need to develop a product and develop a market and so forth. It's very difficult to do that internally, and particularly now the banks are no longer participating in this process at all. So basically you've got to find risk capital. You've got to sell some equity in your company in order to fund the development phase before you can build your business. And risk capital is a potentially a very big problem here in Scotland. We actually we held a workshop. We had 20 attendees. From various places. Donald was one of the attendees, from banks, from angel syndicates, from corporate finance advisors, from public sector and so forth as well. And we came to some interesting conclusions, and the report is now written and it's just being formatted now, so it'll be out in a couple of weeks' time. The main area we found is that Scotland is actually very, very strong in seed finance. Angel funding is very, very strong in Scotland. There's two reasons for this. One is the UK's fiscal policy, which creates a couple of schemes. One is EIS and the other one is SEIS. And the EIS programme, which has been going for 20 years now, no, 15 years now, EIS programme gives good tax breaks to people who invest in early stage risk companies. So you get a tax break going in, and you also get tax-free gains coming out. And that's very attractive to angel investors. And because of that, we've got a good, strong angel community in the UK. Here in Scotland, we've got a particularly strong angel community because of the Scottish Enterprises Co-Investment Fund, which matches funding from angels. So an angel group that can raise £300,000 can invest £600,000 into a company. And that makes a huge difference because that's the right sort of level for these types of startup companies. So angel funding is very strong in Scotland, and that's great. But there are some problems with the next stage of this. The next level of risk capital is almost impossible to achieve. There are very, very, very few venture capitalists. Venture capitalists have moved away from this sector. Venture capitalists have moved away from early stage and have moved away from risk. So venture capitalists who used to be involved in backing early stage or growth companies and so forth have now moved up into private equity. And we don't have the funds that we used to have for risk capital. There's a good reason for this. The sector doesn't perform. In 2001, there was the dot-com boom and bust, and a lot of value was wiped out. The companies that got started, the venture capital companies that got started after that phase, the companies that they backed were going to mature around about 2007, 2008, and we all know what happened in 2008. And because of that, we've had a blight over this whole sector. For the last sort of 12 years, there's been almost no returns in this sector. And corporate finance people who put their money into good bets, they say, well, I'm not going to put money into this because it doesn't make money. Why should I do that? And that's understandable. So the venture capital area has actually languished because of that. But government can intervene here, and government does intervene. I mean, the EIS thing is a government intervention, and the Capital for Enterprise programme, I don't know how many of you know about Capital for Enterprise, but it's a UK government scheme that creates new venture capitalists and backs them. It puts in 25 million, and that's two-thirds of the fund that can, so you can put another 12.5 million on top of that and create a £37.5 million fund. And the government only wants a fixed return, and all the entrepreneurial gains from these funds go back to the private investor. And that's quite an attractive programme, but it's limited because of European state aid rules to 25 million, which makes it kind of suboptimal. But we do think there are ways in which we can be more intelligent about the way we create new funds. And we think there are sources of funds that could be tapped if we address this. It's possible, perhaps, to tap into some of the pension funds. Pension funds at the moment don't really participate in this sector because of the way they are measured and so forth. We think it might be possible to give them a different kind of measure or a different kind of guarantee, or maybe an underwritten government guarantee, so that they could participate in the event. Because if we don't have risk capital, we're not going to have companies, and we're not going to have an economic future. So we need to solve this problem of how we're going to have substantial risk capital. So a recommendation of our committee is that we set up an advice group for government. And we've just had a meeting with Scottish Financial Enterprise, and they're very keen to work with us on this. So our recommendation that we're going to make in this report is that we set up an advice group to look into the whole area of what kind of new forms of risk capital can be created and where can they come from, and with maybe a little bit of government support or encouragement or whatever, or that type of thing. Can we create some new types of Scottish solutions to this problem?
Deputy Convener, Mr. Hughes.
Thanks. I was interested in the point about, some countries are kind of naturally more entrepreneurial than others, and presumably that can be changed, but how do we change that? I mean, your point about attitudes, absolutely. I mean, I'm a believer in attitudes are really, really important. But not to preempt the kind of final session, but I mean, is there something practical we could do? Do we take Brian Souter and send him around all the schools, or Jim McCall, or, you know, is there something like that we could actually do?
There are things that we have been doing. I mean, we've got the Youth Enterprise Programme in schools that Tom Hunter underwrote to start with, and that's actually done, I think, a great job. But, you know, that's been going, what, 8 years? The kids are still in high school, so they're not out yet, you know. So, you know, it'll take a long time. It takes a long time to change our culture. Tom Devine's written about this at length. I mean, the whole entrepreneurial culture that Scotland knew in Victorian times, you know, where we really took on the world, you know, was wiped out in the First World War because, you know, the Scottish entrepreneurial classes were mown down, all these sort of things, you know. And the Second World War, we supported all the heavy industries that were no longer competitive because we needed them, you know, all that sort of thing. So over the 20th century, we became a more dependent nation. And we need to get back to that old atmosphere of, you know, we can do things.
Okay, and Mr. Hughes to be followed by Professor Diamond.
Just interested in Ian's comments about the pension funds. Now, I've done quite a bit of research into the differences between the American history in funding VCs and here. And like a lot of people, I always thought it was cultural and market-driven, and that they funded their VCs very heavily, particularly from the late 1970s onwards. And I was intrigued. I found out a lot of people knew bits and pieces, but not all of it. But I was intrigued to find out that it was driven by statute in the 1970s, in other words, by the will of government. The 1974 ERISA Act came along to make pension fund managers more liable because of some disasters with these massive pension funds in the US. But that didn't do it, and it was actually, interesting enough, a change to an old clause in pension fund guidance on investment, which was the prudent man rule, which said a prudent man would not invest in VCs. They took the not out, some bright guy in the federal government, and the floodgates opened, and that was 1979, and the Apple IPO was in December 1980, which is the biggest IPO since Ford Motors, and the graphs are there. They're quite interesting, and returns in those first 2 decades were phenomenal, were very good, not so good now. But the key point, I think, was that it was done by the hand of government. It was lobbied for, but it was not waiting for market forces. It was done by act, by statute.
Mr. Diamond.
Just comment on a few points that Ian made. I completely agree with his point that universities need to make sure that they're talking to industry in planning their courses. That's why they all do. Let me make that very clear. That's why they all do that. Over 115 professional bodies are working with universities across Scotland to ensure that their needs are met. In my own university, all our students are undertaking their undergraduate degrees with a set of graduate attributes which were agreed in conversation with industry and with the CBI, and which are providing the skill sets that those industries said they need. So I have to say that this is happening. I take Ian's point that perhaps universities shouldn't be doing spin-outs. Well, I think that's plain wrong. I will continue at the University of Aberdeen to make money from our spin-outs, and we believe that is good for Scotland. And we believe that other universities, I know, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Strathclyde's Technology Innovation Centre is just unbelievably good, and will continue to do that. But at the same time, our graduates are incredibly important. We do look out to industry, and I recall Richard Lambert's review in 2003, which Melford Campbell was on, which actually started off looking at universities and came back saying business has to look to universities, and it is a two-way street. And could I make the point, Ian also pointed out that we do need academic industry interface. Yes, we do, and increasingly universities are looking to do that. There are ways that we manage people who spend time in and out of industry and promote them. All universities in the last few years, and I know from my previous position, I used to speak to universities saying you have to do this, build industrial liaison as part of promotion categories. And so I do think, while I agree with everything Ian has said, absolutely agree with everything Ian has said, I would point out that the journey that the universities are on is perhaps a little further than might have been applied by what he said.
Okay. Well, we've had an interesting and eclectic discussion. We've looked at the role of higher education skills development and lessons from successful Scottish companies and accessing finance and stimulating investment. Of course, however, we are quite keen to look at the draft budget and lean on your expertise around this table. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm very keen to hear how, from your experience and from some of the things you've heard and we've discussed today, how the Scottish Government can help deliver sustainable economic growth through this budget, which changes, for example, could be made, what's going well, what do you think should be done differently? So I'm quite keen to hear the views, particularly of our witnesses on these issues. Professor McRae.
Well, thanks, Convener. I start from the position that if you look at the sort of capital investment spend on a country basis, whether it's Scotland or UK, that we compare poorly, actually, to many of our particularly European competitors. Then I look at the most recent results on the Scottish economy for Q1 of this year, and I look at the level of business investment, which is about 17% of total GDP. It's actually lower now than it was in cash terms, and it's still lower than it was in 2007. You know, that's quite a stark figure. I then look at the budget, the draft budget, and I notice that the capital spend in Scotland for 2007-8 was $4.5 billion, and the figure for 12-13 is 3.1. These are all cash terms, so if you put in inflation, it would obviously be even more severe. So the level of capital spending at 3.1 in 12-13 is substantially lower than it was in 2007-8. Now I note that it goes up to $4 billion in the year 14-15, and that is sustained by a switch of 270 million in a transfer from the resource budget to the capital budget, which I commend and I think is very sensible. It also relies heavily on 973 million of that 4 billion total in the year 14-15 from the NPD, you know, the non-profit. Yeah. So I make the point that the capital spend in Scotland going forward is, you have to say, is low compared to what it has been. Now, I quite realise that you know, the Scottish Government is constrained by its total budget, but I would argue that we should be looking to increase those totals in capital spending in each of the next 3 or 4 years. That's my first point. Second thing is,
should that be at the expense of, in terms of the fixed budget, what should it be at the expense of? Because we have many debates in the Parliament which everybody says we should spend more money on A, B, C, D, but nobody seems to say we should spend less money on other areas in order to balance the budget.
I would argue that the total should be increased, and that it shouldn't necessarily come from a cutback in what you might call resource spending.
So should that be by raising taxes? Because obviously we have limited powers here in terms of our budget.
No, I'm suggesting that has to come from the UK government, and and I would argue that and this is a personal view, I have to say, I would argue that the date by which we have to have a sort of balanced budget should be pushed forward a bit. There's a risk at the moment. How do you balance the risk of reduced growth, even no growth, against the risk of a high debt to GDP ratio? And I think the balance of that, in my view, is coming down to extending the time by which we are in balance, and by increasing spending on capital investment projects. That's my first point. Second point is on procurement. I think we have a lot more to do on that in Scotland. And thirdly, I believe that both Highlands and Isles enterprise and Scottish enterprise should be targeted much more on supporting high growth firms than they are at the moment.
Thank you. Professor Mason.
Away in a minute because my wife's got a hospital appointment, so thank you for letting me come in early. I would suggest that we need funding for entrepreneurship centres in every Scottish university, something around the lines of a Hunter Centre in my previous university that looks both inwards to educate students on entrepreneurship education and entrepreneurship career, and also can have the interface with companies externally to find placements and so on. Where would the money come from? Well, perhaps divert some of the money that's trying to produce high growth firms through R&D spending, as I said earlier, perhaps that is maybe a little bit misplaced, and perhaps some kind of reallocation of university funding would be what I would suggest. But before that money goes in, I would suggest some kind of thinking needs to be done about what's the best practice in this area. In England, there was a QAA report on best practices in entrepreneurship education. There's a lot of what's labelled entrepreneurship education, which is not terribly effective, and I think we would want to really understand what is the best practice ways of doing entrepreneurship education before we let universities spend money under this heading. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy?
Thank you, Convener. Well, first of all, there are no easy answers to the question you've set. If there were, I'm sure that the government and others would have found them. But I'd actually like to start by quoting from the Royal Society of Edinburgh's evidence advice paper to you following your consultation on the budget. And I think they state there that it is essential when setting the budget that the government takes a strategic long-term view and links in a transparent and consistent way spending to outcomes within this strategic context, and also provides clear, transparent reporting on its spending and the impact this has on the Scottish economy. And that, we state, would allow the Scottish Parliament, including the Finance Committee, to take a significantly enhanced role in assessing and then improving the draft budget. Now that's, I think, very important, this transparency, because to take the example of investment, capital investment, I very much agree with Donald that it was the right decision to transfer money from Dell Resources to Dell Capital. But I quote from the SPICE document of last month, I think it is, where they state the Scottish Government has proposed transferring £250 million from Dell Resource to Dell Capital in 2013-14, but this proposal is not reflected in the capital and resource totals within the document. In other words, they can't find out if that money is being transferred, how it's been transferred, where it's coming from and where it's going to. And I think it's absolutely critical that we all, particularly ourselves, have consistent data so we can monitor the changes through the financial year and between financial years in the way that we know what is happening. I also think it's critical that we have clarity on how particular activities are expected to contribute to the outcomes that are the priorities so far as the government and Parliament are concerned. And that is not there in every instance. So that's why I welcome the outcome agreements for the universities and the FE institutions, and I would welcome it across the piece. And there are other words in the ROC evidence that I was involved with producing that I really do underscore and commend to you. So far as specifics are concerned, I take the point on procurement, and I'm delighted that the Sustainable Procurement Bill is out to consultation at the moment. We have a seminar coming up on that. We've offered a session with the relevant committee of the Scottish Parliament, which will probably be early next year. Delighted to get engaged, delighted to try and think through how one can combine efficient procurement with procurement that is to the best value added within Scotland. And I think that's not an easy task, but it's one that merits close attention and merits the right procurement decisions. I agree with the better targeting of high and Scottish enterprise funds, and I think at times that may make difficult decision-making for the enterprise bodies and for government. If we're going to put more funding into high-growth firms, where within those budgets does it come from? I just leave that hanging because there are other priorities that the government has that Scottish enterprise and high take account of. It may merit consideration. And one final point is on FE. Now, I gave evidence to the Education Committee last week, and I emphasised what I've been beginning to understand better about the role of FE in skill development and the very close links there are with businesses in individual areas. And I like the changes in the structure that are going through. I believe there are very substantial efficiency gains that can come from it. But I worry, as I've said earlier, about whether the resource is going to be there for the skill development end of FE on a lifetime learning basis. And I think that is a priority that you should make sure is addressed because it is necessary. As Stephen said, we've got We've done well on HE, and the worry is elsewhere, lower down the level of skills and human capital. That's where Scotland has traditionally failed to produce the right contribution to growth. We failed to make best use of people with FE skills within business. We failed to develop people with the right skills and impart those. I think FE can encourage entrepreneurial activity for very small businesses and micro businesses. It can also have very close links at that low and medium skill level. And businesses then need to want to make use of them. Businesses still tend to take people and then not encourage them to perform in a way that many other countries do. So I think that FE is actually an area that merits your close attention, because I think that HE is doing very well, both in terms of its contribution and, dare I say, in terms of its funding. The question whether FE is sufficiently resourced and sufficiently targeted. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Stephen, to be followed by Ian.
Convener, briefly, I would stop doing two things. I would stop spending public money trying to encourage people to start up businesses, and I would stop spending public money on encouraging universities to spin out research and development. I would do more of two things that the government is already doing. Where possible, I would allocate money from revenue to capital. And above all, taking to heart your point that this is about sustainable development for the long term, and with a concern myself about equity, I would take all the resources I could lay my hands on and put them into very active early years support for young people and their families, because without question, that's where the biggest returns to investment will come from. So those are two things I would do more of. And finally, I'd look for opportunities to find these businesses that might be hidden in parts of the public sector.
Thank you very much, Ian. Ian-Ritchie.
I've one practical recommendation. When I started my company in the mid-80s, and it was backed by Scottish Development Finance, which was part of the SDA at the time, and the first thing they told me is we don't lead investments, but then they went on to lead the investment. And because the way they operated, they worked very much in partnership with other people. And of the 4 venture capitalists that came into my company, 3 of them were London-based venture capitalists, and SDF was there sort of making it all happen. And that was, and Colin Mason referred to, how do we get venture capital from around the world here? Venture capital has had, in the last 20 years and so forth, has got much more global, and they're much more willing to invest anywhere that smart people are. But they do usually require a local partner. And the local partner has to be kind of fairly savvy and hands-on, and go to the board meetings and keep an eye on them and maintain them and so forth. Now, Scottish Development Finance continued on until about 2003, when it was privatised and turned into Scottish Equity Partners. And I was on the board of Scottish Enterprise when that was done, and I approve of it. It was the right thing to do. And we now have a very, very strong private sector venture capital group based in Glasgow, and they invest all over Europe, and that's great. But we lost Scottish Development Finance. Scottish Development Finance was required to invest only in technology and only in Scotland. Well, only in, technology, basically the widest definition of technology, and only in Scotland. And that, by the way, didn't cost money, it made money. It made a shed load of money. Scottish Development Finance made really great returns. So I think there's time. It's time now to look at reinventing Scottish Development Finance within Scottish Enterprise as a private sector partnership deal. So, they would work like venture capitalists, as the old SDF did. It's not a bureaucracy, it's not a government agency. They really are, they feel and look like venture capitalists. But they partner with venture capital groups from London, from around Europe, from Boston and so forth. And I think there's 2 particular areas that need attention here. Because of the way angel money is very good at the sort of £1 to £2 million level, my sector, informatics, that's okay for us. But for 2 sectors, for life sciences and for green energy, the amounts of money required are larger and longer term. And the angel community cannot do these things. They really just can't fund £10 million for 10 years. That's not what angels can do. So I think there's a good reason why we should look at setting up a couple of SDF funds, SDF-like funds again. One for life sciences, one for green energy. How would we pay for this? Well, as I've said, it actually doesn't cost money in the longer term. It makes money, But we'd have to divert some funding. And it would be a relatively small amount of funding. If the fund was set up at 100 million for 5 years, that would only be 20 million in the first year. And I'm afraid, I think Scottish Enterprise could find 20 million if they had to or tried to. or indeed we could find it from other schemes that we've got. So we're not talking about, you know, the Scottish budget's 30 billion. We're not talking about a huge amount of money, but that money would be very strategic in generating future investment for future companies.
Now, Professor Diamond or Mr Hughes, who wants to go first? Professor Diamond?
Thank you very much. If I may have two Mandy Rice-Davies moments. Firstly, to welcome the Scottish Government's continued commitment to higher education. I think it's an absolutely important one if we are to get to Scotland, to the Scotland that we want to become. Secondly, that I welcome in Mr Swinney's statement last week, as I said earlier, the commitment to an Energy Skills Academy, which brings together FE and HE and really, you know, strives to provide the skills that the whole energy industry needs. If then I say, well, what do we need to do? Echoing what Jeremy has said, I think we really do need to think about the FE business interaction. There's no point in just training people in FE if there are not industry careers for them which offer them opportunities to go up a ladder. In other words, you don't just want to train people with a set of skills and say, well, you've got your set of skills now, go away and use them for 40 years. You actually need to go in and to have the opportunity to go up a ladder, because that gets productivity, and that seems to me to be an incredibly important thing that the government can work with industry to assure. Secondly, we need to think and to develop ways of financing postgraduate taught courses, particularly postgraduate taught courses which are linked to industry needs. Industry should be part of that, but I think government needs to bring something into it, particularly for disadvantaged students, and I think some kind of mean-tested maintenance around that would be incredibly helpful. And finally, just simply to reiterate what I've said earlier about procurement, I do think getting public sector procurement driving innovation is incredibly important. And to echo again what Jeremy said, I personally have written on this and would be very happy to provide any help in any way.
Last word is with yourself, Mr Hughes.
Thank you very much. I just really restricted to my own area because it's what I know best, but I would just like to see continuing support for the excellent SE products and services and the Gateway contract. It's where I work. The pipeline service is less well known an account managed service, but it's a forerunner to it, and it's very rich because we work not just with SE products, but with other products and services through the likes of Edinburgh Chamber and City Council and so on. So I'd like to see that resource continued and possibly expanded. There's myself and one other colleague, John Harkins, run that in the city. The whole of Edinburgh on this pipeline service, and you can only do so much. So it is a good service, and when it works really, really well. Whilst we've been doing that, we developed an initiative a year ago. Myself and Howard Flint, formerly of Link, developed a product called Road to Investment, supported by the Gateway and Edinburgh Chamber, where we wanted to get 12 companies together every quarter to teach them about all the subjects they need to know about investment. Our experience was they didn't understand the subject. The money was there, they had the skills, technical skills and so on, but they did not understand the language. So that was a product that came out of that union between the Chamber and Gateway, and we've trained about 50 people in the last year and raised about $1.5 million, including matching funding, by running that, what I pretty well call an academy of learning how to raise investment, both public and private sector.
Thank you very much, and indeed I'd like to thank all our distinguished guests for their very helpful and informed contributions. I'm going to suspend the session until 11:40 to give members of the committee a natural break and also to allow witnesses to leave. Thank you. I will reconvene the committee. I'd like to apologise to the committee for starting almost 3 minutes later than I said we would. The third item on the committee's agenda today is to receive a report back from members on the employability workshops that took place on Friday. As part of its examination of the need to improve employability of those furthest from the labour market, the committee held one-day workshops in Ardrossan, Dundee and Dumfries, meeting over 45 organisations from the public, private and third sector, as well as meeting individuals to hear about their own job-seeking experiences. And so what I'm going to do now is we're going to have just a discussion on basically what happened. We'll try and keep it reasonably brief, but I don't want to restrict anybody if people want to make any comments. And I suppose I should kick off with the one in Ardrossan, which I attended with Michael McMahon. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to you a couple of points. I'm not going to go through the excellent notes that Jim and Ross actually prepared for that meeting, because they will all be appended on a report, so people can actually look in depth. It also means that by doing so I won't miss things out. But I will make some comments, and of course, Michael, you can follow on and any salient points that you wish to make. I think there was what was really interesting, I think, about the Ardrossan one was that there seemed to me somewhat a disconnect between perceptions in some of the different groups. For example, the first session in terms of local employability partnership representatives, they talked about providing employees with individuals and skills they need. They talked about partnership working. They talked about the complex employability landscape. They also, however, conceded that there was an issue in terms of competing with each other for funding to reach the targets. They made issues about how big public sector employers are doing a lot less in the private sector in terms of the employability issue. And they talked about the need for co-location, a physical close proximity of a shared space in terms of providing employability services, and the importance of schools and local flexibility. But where that was contradicted was the fact that the local business sector didn't seem to feel that they had much engagement at all with employability agencies, in fact, and they seemed to think it was almost a kind of, you know, that they get what they called aggressive phone calling from various different organisations and agencies asking if they would take someone, and they seemed to simply offer, you know, financial inducements. The problem was that these inducements didn't seem to be particularly important to the employers relative to the need to have the right person sent to them. I think a lot of employers really had concerns that they were just sent people, you know, regardless of that individual's particular interests, aptitudes or skills. And that seemed, for example, from the kind of hotel and catering sector, there was a deep sense, I felt, of frustration that there didn't appear to be any cognizance taken of what kind of employer it was, and that they were simply actually sent someone almost to meet kind of targets. So there's not enough focus on asking employers what they need. There was talk of employers of building the right attitudes to work and a desire to get that as early as primary school, particularly in areas where people are in second, third generation of unemployment. They also didn't believe that the education system was fit for purpose in getting some school leavers ready for work. There was a real issue about such as the effectiveness of some placements in terms of soft skills, and the DUP, I have to say, came in for particular criticism in terms of sending people who were not appropriate. They also talked about the lack of long-term placements, and that people were being sent to them clearly without basic necessary skills. The experiences of Scottish Enterprise, which contradicted perhaps some of what we heard earlier on today, were mixed. And there's concern about the process of allocation of grants. We did actually hear some of that concern coming out today as well, of course, about RSA grants, and some people seem to be exasperated about how difficult it is to get grants and who gets them. There was an issue about the planning system in North Ayrshire, which seemed to be that it's easier to say no to an application than actually approve it, and that was restricting some business developments. And businesses should be allowed to get funding directly to do their own training, rather than funding being allocated to agencies who perhaps had a mismatch with training needs. And there was a real concern about the benefit system, flexibility, and they also talked about things which we don't have any control over, such reserved issues like VAT on building would help things, getting banks to lend more money, etc. In terms of third sector organisations, there was actually a feeling that the agencies are less joined up than they have been perhaps previously, and the need to co-design, co-produce services. The work programmes are done on the cheap, and the compulsory component of the benefit system was counterproductive. There was a real issue, and this came up later with the service users, about the need to build confidence and self-esteem of people within the school system, and support for employability programmes and entrepreneurship programmes in school, they believe, are crucial in getting young people the right focus. Again, real concern about focus on targets and numbers, and soft skills should be included when measuring outcomes. The problem is, as they perceive it, is that the DWP in particular is focused only on getting people into work, and they think that that is not really helpful in terms of some of the individuals that are concerned who are effectively bypassed by the system as a result. And that when it comes to tenders, there's not enough weight given to the quality of schemes, which of course need a greater time and intensity, rather than just numbers that are actually being processed through. So I think there's an issue of a kind of sausage machine mentality in terms of processing some of these things. They have... They're supportive of what local authorities are doing, North Ayrshire Council in particular, but they feel that the NHS, for example, is more difficult to work with in terms of employability. And the private, again, they emphasise that the private sector was better than the public sector. So basically what they were saying was that we need less short-term funding, be less reactive and more long-term approach, something which the trade unions actually commented to some months ago. There needs to be more accountability and transparency in relation to what the employability budget is being spent on, what it can deliver, and the priority should be on a one-to-one focus, which wasn't exactly what the ILO said last week, but that was the emphasis that came just today. And finally, the service users section, there was a consensus that the most effective work programmes are those which focus on positive thinking, confidence building and teamworking. There was a real issue, though, among participants, most of whom I think we had, who were older than the 18 to 24 age bracket, that most interventions are directed towards the young, and the older long-term unemployed were therefore a major disadvantage in terms of employability programmes, especially for example, women who've been out of the labour market because perhaps have been raising children. All had negative experiences with the Job Centre and the Department of Work and Pensions. Lack of flexibility, unwelcoming, intimidating environment, for example, were all stressed. Also, inconsistency of advice in terms of that provided by the DWP in relation to benefits while in training courses. You know, if you go on a certain course, will you not lose a benefit, which is clearly a real issue. And again, the compulsory element of people just square pegs being put into round holes just for the sake of box ticking at the DWP. And there was criticism of some of the training courses offered, which are viewed as being mass-produced and generic. Real concern about people not being treated as individuals. Michael, anything you want to add to any of those things?
Comprehensive overview of it. As I said, the two things that struck me, I went down there, it's not my area geographically, so I was trying to compare and contrast the information that was being given to me by people in different sectors, and comparing that with the knowledge I have from speaking to those sectors in my own area. And while there were specifics down in Ardrossan that related to North Ayrshire, they were very comparable to the issues that I was aware of in my own area. So it seems to be that there is a Scotland-wide issue here. It's not a geographical or local problem. And that problem seemed to be, as the convener has said, a too great an emphasis on quantity rather than quality. And there was this tick box exercise of getting numbers through was working against both the private employers who wanted to be engaged to provide training and opportunities, and the public sector who wanted to be seen to be getting as many people through as they could. And I just think we have to get a focus on, you know, what is it that the outcome that we're looking for, because there was a lot of evidence provided that just churning numbers through the system was not sustainable, and that if they actually took time to work with people on an individual basis, or even on a more focused basis over a longer period of time, the opportunities for those people to stay in employment or to have the skills to go on and have greater experiences in the workforce was much more effective, and then the longer term would be more stable and more sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add one final comment is that employers really felt as if often their time has been wasted because they were sent people who were clearly inappropriate to the skill base that was required by that company, and it was just a case of just firing anybody over to them. And some of the people who came were obviously, you know, of a high calibre, and there was no difficulty there. But others were clearly didn't have the attitude or the aptitude right in any way, and they felt quite aggrieved that they were putting some of their you know, busy people were putting their time into to interview folk who were just not suitable, and that preparatory work was not being done before they were being sent to these employers. That was a real issue. I'm going to move on to the Dumfries session with John and Elaine. I don't know who wants to kick off. Elaine.
Yeah, it was a good session. We started off obviously with the public sector and the local employability partnership, who believed that they were telling us a very good story, and they were able to talk about their partnership way working. They had a sort of a table of what their aims were and what they would, when they expected to be able to achieve various of these aims. They said that there was a problem with work placements, particularly in rural areas where there are not many SMEs who are able to take on work placements. I mean, there's a problem actually getting the small, medium-sized enterprises to take on work placements. They felt that there possibly ought to be more emphasis on the key areas in the area, like hospitality and tourism and leisure and so on, that somehow these are still being seen as not being good careers, and that actually ought to be more emphasis on that. They felt that one-to-one support was successful, but they said it was costly. I think maybe we wondered why, if it's that costly for the public sector to do it, why they weren't involving the third sector a bit more in that. There was a feeling that some of the sort of national schemes are a bit too urban-centric and not necessarily as well tailored to rural communities as they could be. And they also talked quite a lot about what they call the pipeline. It was actually getting people along to the point where they become employable, rather than just about the successes all along that pipeline, as it were. And it's not just about getting people out the end into a job, but actually the progression the person makes along the journey. They had another piece of jargon, which I had not heard before, called hiding the wiring, which apparently involves some... which involved a scheme which they were obviously very pleased about an offer they were going to say was an employer offer on recruitment and training and so on, which had been recently launched and which they felt, you know, could offer a service to employers. That sounded quite good until we asked the local businesses what they thought of it, and nobody had consulted them about it at all. And I think that was again with the third sector, I felt there was still a disconnect between the public sector and the other partners. They weren't also, maybe the public sector is getting better at speaking to each other, but they're not necessarily communicating as well as they could do yet with the private sector and the third sector. And indeed, this employer offer was seen as being competition for the private sector, because they thought, well, some of us do that, and now the public sector is trying to come in and do some things that we do. So there was a bit of that was a fairly large concern amongst the local businesses, that there wasn't enough private sector involvement in the local employability partnership. There was a strong feeling that actually you need to be able to train management. It's not just about training the people at the bottom. And if you're looking, I suppose, at the sort of demand side, it's actually training the managers as well. And there needs to be more done on that. Felt probably needed a bit more involvement in the school curriculum in order to explain what the opportunities of the various sectors were. There also, a feeling, and actually that was true of the public sector as well, is that there's too many schemes, too many different funding streams. I know the Scottish Government are beginning to address that, because I think actually in the new, refreshed Working for Growth, there's talk about a single employability fund. So I think maybe that might begin to cover some of the concerns about being too many different funding streams and so on. Strangely was feeling that sort of one of the problems in schools was that people went to school, then to university, and came back to school as a teacher. And two of the sessions said that, and they hadn't got the life skills and experience maybe to be able to teach, or to be able to, expose pupils to the other opportunities of work, because they themselves hadn't had the same. A bit of a concern about whether we were actually going to have people with the right skills when the economy starts growing again. Are we actually investing the skills that we will need to grow the economy at that point? And just to say generally a sort of a view that the landscape is too complex. The third sector also felt it was difficult to get the third private and public sector round the table. You know, there's a lot of talk about working together, but they didn't really feel that it was working as well as it should be. They also talked about duplication of effort. Some felt actually one of the third sector organisations felt that it wasn't, you know, there's a rather low referral rate from skills development Scotland. Well, more than one of them thought that. And they also felt that really the SDS didn't cope with in the third sector, we had people from Apex and so on, some people who were very, very far from the job market had real significant problems. And they felt in some ways some of these sorts of youngsters weren't really being catered for by some of the public sector initiatives, and that they weren't being referred on. You know, it was really, some of those young people have very little way, sort of core skills, and that, you know, that they needed assistance with that. Problems also engaging youngsters at school. Again, about chasing funding, significant issues around the chasing of funding. And with I thought that actually the service users were very interesting, actually. I thought their input was very interesting indeed, because they talked about the real barriers that they experienced in getting into work. That in rural areas, you would not be surprised to hear a lot of that was around transport, actually being able to get to work. Or there's one youngish man who lived in Kirkconnell, eventually got offered a job in Annan, but it cost £12.30 a day to travel there. And by the time he'd the travel costs and what he lost in benefit, he would be doing it for £8 a week. Another young woman described how, you know, the bus to Dalbeattie left at 11 o'clock at night. Didn't matter what she was in hospitality. It doesn't matter what time her shift finished. You know, if it finished at 7 o'clock, she still had to hang around in order to get the 11 o'clock bus. So big issues around, you know, transport in rural areas. Also, rather shockingly, actually, somebody saying that, you know, a young woman who's a mother of youngest children having problems actually with employers asking about her childcare arrangements, which I actually thought was illegal. But, you know, she had fairly large employers saying to her, you know, and how will you manage the shifts when you've got young children? But also that childcare was an issue, particularly in the sorts of businesses which exist in rural areas, like hospitality, like maybe the big retailers and so on, where you may be expected to work weekends or nights. There's not that many childminders that you can employ in order to look after your kids in those times. So there's big issues around that as well. You know, it felt actually, you know, that more information and guidance could come out. They also felt that government should make more use of the social media to get information out there. So I thought that was quite interesting. I suppose that maybe reflected the age group of people who felt like we could be doing more on that. I think there was a feeling that, yeah, there are some jobs out there, but the difficulty in rural areas like Dumfries and Galloway is actually being able to get into them and get to the job in the first place.
Thank you. John, anything you wish to add to that?
Yes, no, that was pretty comprehensive. I mean, I think, like Michael, I found it good to be in a completely different area. I mean, originally I was going to go to Dundee, but I ended up in Dumfries. And, you know, Dumfries is a big town, but there was a lot of people we had from out with. And I think also they were very appreciative. I think I probably got more credibility from coming down from Glasgow, whereas Elaine was obviously more local. So, I mean, I think the wider issue is I think it is extremely good. I know it's time-consuming. It causes me problems like everybody else, but I think it is good to do that kind of thing. I think people really appreciate it. They're being listened to. We got that from all the sectors that I think we saw. Yeah, I mean, a number of issues. The point was about some stuff is too urban-centric. Both the public and employers talked about you know, incentivising employers, which was quite interesting. Now, some of that, of course, is out with our control. So they'd like, you know, NIC advantages or corporation tax advantages, maybe if they were taking people on. But that kind of idea of being more joined up and non-domestic rates was another one they suggested. I don't know if they wanted a bit of relief if they took people on there again. Certainly the bit about the private sector not being included, although the public sector thought they were. So there's a wee bit of a lack there. The fact that, you know, catering, hospitality is so big in that area, major industry or employment sector, and yet there's not training facilities there. Whereas I think the Highlands, I believe there is a kind of a centre of excellence or something. So that seemed like an obvious one that somebody needs to tackle. The school stuff came up, and I mean, I'm not sure I've fully got my head around it. There was a slight discussion about what are core skills, what are soft skills, because I think some of us have been using these interchangeably, but there was some feeling that You know, core skills would be things more like problem solving, whereas the soft skills is maybe more communication, that kind of thing. The feeling that the £2,000, you know, for an employer who took on somebody was a big advantage, and disadvantageous if that wasn't there. The idea that 26 weeks is not really long enough for a lot of young people to get them kind of trained up. A bit of criticism of everything has to be innovative. I think that both probably from council level, government level, every level, people think they have to have new ideas, whereas for the third sector and things, that can just become confusing. And probably transport. And a good point, I think, from the third sector too was people need to be allowed to fall off the bus a couple of times. In other words, they blow it a couple of times and you still give them a chance. And for some people that's necessary. So I thought that was quite a good point as well. Okay.
Thank you very much. Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll restrict myself to maybe just to one point from each of the 4 meetings. I mean, again, I'd echo the points. I thought it was a great idea, and for me, certainly, it was a very valuable day spending it in Dundee, again, out of my own region, and getting a chance just to speak to people I've not come into contact with because they're in a different region. I'll start with the service users. To me, that was actually a pretty inspirational session, listening to people that had turned their lives around and who really talked quite eloquently about it. I suppose that there are lots of key points there, but the one I'll maybe leave you with is this idea of whether it should be individuals or groups. They were pretty adamant that a group setting is better. Now, I'm sure there's exceptions, but they felt the sheer act of having to go into a group of people you don't know, getting through that in itself boosts your confidence up. And then when you do go to work afterwards, that's how it's going to happen in the real world. You're not going to get one-to-one in the real world in your job. And they basically said everyone in the group then became quite good friends, and they actually became a support network for each other through the highs and lows of the courses that they went through. So I just flagged that up as it seems to tie in with what the ILO said to this committee a couple of weeks ago. In relation to third sector organisations, the biggest frustration was funding, and the fact that it's quite often single-year funding, and they wanted, as you'd imagine, longer stretches of time. Even 2-year funding, they said, would be a big improvement, but they were pushing for 3-year funding. But they also talked about the optimum length of time for working with individuals, and again, it echoes what others have said. If you're only having a few weeks with somebody, in most cases it will make minimal difference. There'll be exceptions again, but actually you need at least 6 months, probably closer to a year in most cases, in order to actually make a meaningful difference. With the businesses, I think the biggest frustration, and it was mainly small businesses, the bigger ones, I suppose, were a little bit better plugged in, but the small ones had the frustration that we've heard about before of just the landscape is still quite crowded. It wasn't always clear who you would go to speak about a particular issue. And because the head of HR is also the head of health and safety, the head of pretty much everything within the business, they just don't have time to go and look at 4 or 5 websites or make 4 or 5 calls. They actually just want one person they phone. They don't care what that person then does and who it's then passed down to, I suppose, behind the screen. If there is one person/number they can phone or contact, that would make a huge difference. And at least one of the businesses said that if that were the case, they would probably have at least another 2 apprentices within their business today. And I'm sure that's not an isolated example. In relation to the last one, or the first one we actually had, the employability partnership, I have to say, I mean, while it's just subjective and anecdotal, I got a pretty good feel, I have to say, from the group that they worked with each other, they knew each other, they spoke to each other. They liked each other, but they were happy to disagree as well and debate, which I thought was quite refreshing. I think a lot of that came down to the fact that in Dundee in 2008, when the partnership was formed, they co-located pretty much everything into one office, and so they could hear each other's telephone conversations and just work together on a daily basis. Seems to have worked well, I think, for service users, where I think they feel they need to do a bit of work still is just making sure they engage individual businesses, particularly smaller businesses, and in some cases they're just going out and knocking on the doors of shops and trying to speak to the owner or manager, but that's slow going, and that's where I think they feel they need to do more. But I was quite impressed by them, so that's my sort of brief.
Any comments? Well, obviously Bruce and Jean, who just recently joined the committee, weren't involved in this. I don't know if either of you have any comments to make, or indeed any other committee members get any comments they wish to make at this point.
I say that I mean, I have personal experience of some of the difficulties that every member, I think, has talked about. And I think there's probably merit in looking at how we do get round. What's become very obvious, and it's not only my own business, but businesses generally in the Highlands, is that other European workers coming into the tourism or catering and hospitality trade, which is what I know, don't come through the job centres or Skills Development Scotland or any of these agencies. There's a kind of entrepreneurial spirit there, and this is a change in the last 20 years, where we used to see far more young people across Scotland prepared to move around for jobs or come and take them, and we seem to have got kind of stuck with people in their own area, and not particularly being encouraged to go beyond that. And I don't know why that is.
It's an interesting point. Maybe some people are just more risk averse than perhaps they were. It could be a whole host of different reasons. If, for example, if you're Polish and you're coming to live in Inverness, there's 5,000 or 6,000 Polish people already there, and you've got a probably a community support network. I think it might be sometimes more difficult moving within your own country, apart from accommodation costs and all the rest of it. Also, the expectations, I think, are different, and it's a different type of person that comes from overseas. We have a really high expectation, for example, of Polish workers, but they might not be representative of all the people there. They're the ones we get up and go. So it's not always fair, I think, to compare people who are here with people who have come from elsewhere. And I think you get that in all. Like Scottish immigrants in America are very dynamic. You know?
I would accept that, except that in recent history it wasn't like that. If I tell you that we would get several hundred applications from either, Scottish students or from the Glasgow area particularly, wanting to come and work either on a part-time basis or looking for full-time employment. And that just doesn't happen at all. 1, 2... Most things come through the internet now anyway, but that's...
Relative paying conditions?
That's true.
No. Okay. Anyway, I would like to thank all the participants for their useful contributions, particularly committee members, but I'd also like to thank in particular Dawn Redpath from Dumfries and Galloway Council, Andy Lee from North Ayrshire Council, Alan Miller from Dundee Council, and the respective teams for all their assistance in setting up the workshops, and of course our own clerking team have also done an excellent job on this. All the information that's come in from each of the sessions will go into our employability report, which we hope to have in November. End of November. We're going to have also secured at the Conveners Group a full parliamentary debate on employability in the new year as well. So we'll look forward to that also. Okay, so the final agenda on our today is agenda item 4, which we agreed to take in private. And I'd therefore like to close this part of the meeting, the public part, and just allow a minute for the public and official report to leave.